First of all, thanks for inviting me to talk to your group. This is exciting to have such a wide audience. I've done a lot of these kind of talks, mostly to people just in the Midwest area, and it looks from the grouping there. You got a lot of folks from Idaho. This is a probably uniquely urban problem that we're talking about here, which is how to support a marathon. Although I did do a couple of these long relay races, the Madison to Chicago one. It was harking back to that earlier when you were talking early, Marty. And I also we did a bike event for a number of years, and about 2 years ago, the organizers decided they were going to get rid of ham radio and just do cell phones. So this is a trend that's unfortunately going on in this industry that I guess we need to figure out how to reverse. But this is a happy story, I think, for ham radio, talking about how the ham radio guys got involved with the Chicago Marathon. And let's see here. I got to figure out where my buttons are. That's me. Um, doing public service and ham radio, when I got into ham radio originally, I got into it because I wanted to do public service. I liked, of course, doing DX work, but ham radio and public service always caught my fancy. There are a lot of reasons why we do it. We all know that the FCC encourages us to do it as a quid pro quo for giving us all the bandwidth that we have to play with. But there's a need out there, and there's a need for a lot of different kinds of products, a lot of different kinds of things that we can do that we find ourselves getting involved with. Personally, there's a lot of personal fulfillment in getting involved with this kind of stuff. And the other reason is that we're able to do it. I mean, I think physically and certainly technically, we're able to do this kind of work. So there's a good reason to do it. But the big question to me from the beginning was, where do we serve? Where do you go do this stuff? And so, I started a very long journey that I'm hoping to take you through a little bit of it tonight. But when I started out in ham radio, not a lot of folks in the Chicagoland area wanted us to do public service with them. The police and fire departments, the cities around me, also we've got our own systems. We don't need you. That wasn't necessarily the case outside of the city atmosphere, because you would get closer to a rural area where the police chief knew everybody in town, and there were hams there, and they all went to coffee together, and they played nice. But in the city, we're competing against a million different fire departments, a whole bunch of different fiefdoms. And so ham radio kind of gets lost in the mix. And we did a few things. We've done a couple of little teeny parades and a few little events like that, but they weren't very fulfilling or very satisfying. Where I found my teeth were cut primarily was on this field day stuff. I got caught up in doing field day for our club and turned it into kind of a monster event for a number of years. And I bought into the whole ARR idea that, if all else fails, we'll be there. And so I kind of went in it, full bore with the concept that that's what we had to do, is be prepared for the big one. Big one never came, I guess. But it was a great place, a great training ground. I learned a lot about everything related to bringing a team together. And we were fortunate to be number one in our category for a number of years. And I did that up until until COVID hit. And then I had to kind of back away from a little bit after 15 years. But it turns out, there are times when disaster strikes and when comms fail. This is a picture of a tornado in Kansas. And I got involved with the Red Cross, kind of tangentially to my ham radio career as Sea. I sort of got involved with this ECRV truck that I spent about 12 years working on a team that served us. This particular truck out of Chicago, there were 9 of these to the United States. These were monster communication trucks. It's like a little, communication truck, like a all-in-one knife that can do anything. It was primarily used for satellite communication. So there's a big satellite dish on top of that. And we would dash off to some remote site, deploy a satellite receiver, and then feed a network so that we could get communication into those areas. So I did tornadoes and hurricanes and floods, and really was a very fulfilling period of time until they decided that they were going to disband the program, partly because, in order to send this truck out, they had to have somebody who would be willing to pay for it. And it got to the point where fewer and fewer disasters wanted to put money up front to have us show up. So the program was disbanded. They took all this radio equipment out of those trucks and gave the trucks back to the Red Cross as just a transport vehicle. But it was a great, glorious time where we did a lot of fun things. And in our area, we had 50 people that supported this truck. So at any given time, there were always 2 or 3 people ready to be deployed to go really anywhere. And we were supposed to be ready to go up to 1,000 miles from our home if we had to. And so we did a lot of traveling. We did a lot of things where we'd combine with other trucks and help them out. So I would say this was a positive part of my early experience in public service until they pulled the budget. Um, so the reason to serve, I think, we touched on that a little bit earlier. It says, I think there's a niche for us. We have unique skills that can work. I mentioned the quid pro quo for, using the frequencies that were given. We can be useful. And some of this is a duplicate from what I said before, but the big thing is you need to be prepared, and there is training involved. There's alignment with the goals of your agency, whatever you're working with. There are credentials. There are other things that you need to be prepared to do, and it means you got to be a team player. And I think that was the best thing I learned about the Red Cross is that you don't just you leave your ego at the door and you come in and you do whatever has to be done. And that was an important lesson that I learned from the Red Cross that carried me on. Certainly that was something I learned from even doing our field day work, trying to get everybody to work as a team. So what got me wondering is, how do you compare emergency disasters versus events, since I've been on both of them? And what I found was that there's less and less call for us to work disasters, although I have to say Hurricane Katrina did help bring us back to the fore, to the point where people started to begin to see where ham radio might be useful. But, disasters are unorganized as mess. They're very complex. You might spend years preparing for it, but never really ever get deployed. So there's a lot of downtime, and that can be frustrating. You need to be associated with a served agency. You can't just self-deploy. You can't just show up and say, hey, I'm here today and I've got a radio. Well, that's nice, but we don't want you. So you need to be with a served agency. And so then the issue is finding that agency that works for you. And depending on where you are, that can be easier or more complex. And then if you get deployed, you can be gone for a long period of time. I mean, some of the deployments I went on would be a week, but there were some that went on for 2 months. And boy, you got to be in a spot in your life where you can do that kind of stuff, because it's not so easy just to give up on your work and just walk away from life. But that's what it demanded. And sometimes the circumstances can be very emotionally demanding. I mean, it's not easy to go into a disaster area and watch how people are pulling their lives back together and not somehow be moved by that. And the other thing is that these things can be very challenging physically. You have to do a lot of work. So, those are the things you're up against if you're trying to work with an emergency disaster scenario. On the other hand, if you're doing events, not that some of these don't still apply, but events were a little different. They tend to be scheduled. They're planned in advance. There's a lot of pre-planning that goes into them. So you kind of know when it's coming, when it's going to end. The scale and scope can be huge, but, if you plan it enough, you can actually kind of conquer it pretty well. And then you need to find the right niche for us, for ham radio. I don't think that every event is for ham radio, but you need to find the place where we are suitable. And there was a lot of debate early on in this process of defining how we got involved with the marathon to kind of figure out where our niche was. Where do we actually do the most good? And then we need to sit down and think about how we support our clients, because this is a client relationship. It's not like ham radio is going to come in and save the day. Ham radio is just one more asset in a whole bucket of little tools that they've got to play with to work their event. So a little humility goes a long way in this case. On the other hand, if you're successful at meeting some of these ideas, this can be a great way to show what ham radio does and really provide a seat at the table that we've never really had in a lot of places for some time. And I can tell you stories that are kind of horror stories about how ham radio folks would sometimes come in with a kind of an arrogant stance and manage to get themselves kicked out of places, including, for instance, the Red Cross right here in Chicago. I came in and said I was going to turn my audio down, I guess.
Too low. We lost your audio, Rob.
Hello. How's that?
That's back. That's good.
Yeah. I crossed my arms. Sorry. Uh, Anyway, in Chicago, I was trying to work with the Red Cross. We came in and say, I represent sort of a ham radio community. And these guys said, well, we don't want any ham radio folks here because the last group that was here took all their gear and left, and you kind of left us high and dry. So over the years, ham radio hasn't done itself really a good hasn't done itself a good service. Even though I think in the beginning, there was a place where we actually had a niche in the early days when no one could do the kind of communications we did, and we provided a service. And then we kind of got fat and sassy and started getting arrogant and started demanding things. So, in a way, I feel like our mission was to kind of bring ham radio back to the fore and show that, hey, we can be responsive. We can meet you where you are at and provide you with the supports that you need. So I started digging more into event service, and it's not like I did this purposely. I really didn't want to do this at all. I felt that doing the Chicago Marathon was an Aries project, that they should be doing it. It's not something I want to do. I had my hands full running a ham radio club. I was president for our club for about 10 years. So the question is, how do we get here? And this is a picture of us being there. This is one of our teams working at Station 10 for Chicago Marathon a few years back. First of all, the Chicago Marathon, to explain what it is, it's basically a 26.2-mile run that goes through 26 neighborhoods of Chicago, and this little map outlines all the routes that it goes through. So it really is a very convoluted route through a lot of the canyonlands and the urban and suburban parts of Chicago, downtown Chicago. So it's kind of a varied terrain, although the race itself is noted because it's a very flat terrain. So in a lot of ways, runners love it. But from a from a radio point of view, we have some challenges because we have a lot of big buildings in our way that we've got to muscle through. So how we got here? Well, it started off of a weird circumstance. In 2007, the race started and it was extremely hot. It was 85 degrees at the start, which is, if you've ever run, anything above 70 is pretty dang hot. But 85 was torture. And it wasn't long before they started running into real problems. We had a lot of people who were collapsing. They were overwhelming the medical tents. Yeah, I did it again. I think I still got audio. They overwhelmed the medical tents. The hospitals were starting to get crushed with a lot of ambulance services. In fact, there was one person that actually died that year. And the problem was that they had to stop the race. They knew they had to stop the race, but they didn't have any mechanisms for stopping it. In fact, the only way they could stop it was they had to deploy Chicago policemen who went out arms stretched with billy clubs to physically stop the runners. So I don't know if you know what marathon runners are like, but these are guys who have spent like a year training for this event, and I'll be damned if they're going to stop. They are going to get this medal or get it done because that's what they're there to do. And so to stop the race was a huge task. And it left the organizers really scratching their head about what did we do wrong? How do we fix this mess? And so right after that marathon, they stopped and had to do a lot of rethinking. And one of the things they started thinking about it and they discovered was a lot of marathons use ham radio operators, all for different reasons, all for different ways and different ways. And so they invited us to the table to discuss how we might fit in. What happened after a long discussion about what we can do for them is we found that we are best associated with the medical team. It was a good fit because medical doctors and medical folks typically don't like to communicate by radio or appliances. They want to just take care of patients. And so even though they gave them radios and even though they had cell phones, that was a burden they didn't want to have to deal with. And so they were delighted to have us come in and sort of serve as their communication team. What we found was by exercising our rights to pass health and welfare traffic, it really became the perfect fit for us. And there were a lot of other events that used ham radio, but really kind of abused them. They had them doing a lot of things that ham radio really didn't allow us to do or shouldn't allow us to do, especially for a profit event, which this event is a for-profit event. So, how do we fit into it and still stay within the rules of engagement that the FCC has set up for us? So we found that by doing health and welfare traffic and by doing medical logistics communication, that was really a pretty darn good fit for us. The problem is they asked us to do this in August of 2008, and the race was in October. And so we had to march and get an entire team set up within a very short period of time. But get as many operators as we could and define what the network would be. And I have to tell you, I quit twice on that process because I just didn't believe we could do it in that short a period of time. But somehow we persevered and we actually pulled it off. We had 68 volunteers that first year, and actually demonstrated that we could do it. And it was a proud moment for all of us, even though it wasn't without little scary moments, and I lost a little hair in the process of doing all that stuff. By the way, this is our 15th year of doing the Chicago Marathon, so we've been doing this now for quite a while, and we've learned a lot of lessons along the way. One of the things that we have been providing more and more these days is situational awareness, and that has come about largely because of the craziness in our world these days. I mean, the Boston Marathon is a good example. Lots of other events where they've had incidents that have happened on course where they can't have police everywhere, so they need to have eyes and ears every place. So we have been providing a lot of situational awareness that helps the organizers get a pulse of the race um, along the whole time in sort of real time. If you haven't been to Chicago, there is a massive hospital they build for this event, and Chicago is got its own personality, much like all the other marathons have their own way of doing things. And so what we had to do is learn how they did things so that we could match what they wanted us to do. And so they have a kind of a hub and spoke system, more or less the way the city is set up anyway. That's different from other places. Like the Marine Corps Marathon has a different process. But in this case, they have a hub and spoke system. This is their main hospital they set up for this event. This is a 300-bed hospital that's set up for the marathon. It's got an emergency room, and it's really a high-tech setting. This is them just prepping up for it. I can't take pictures of it, obviously, when there are patients in there. But that's a pretty amazing place. At the end of a race, you'll see every bed is used, and millions of people, or a lot of people, are in there. On site, our role is to basically support the medical tent. And this is a picture on the right there of a typical aid station, a medical aid station. And so if you look, you'll see that there's a wheelchair there, of course, and a table where they check people in. But then that first tent that you see right underneath Athletico is where they will handle people that have fast trackers, that people who just need something quickly done, a Band-Aid or something, they can just hand it to them and let them keep going. The tent behind that is for more serious injuries. And that can be anything from broken bones to heat stroke or other kinds of maladies. And that back tent is the medical tent. Let's see here. This is basically to tell you there's 2,000 medical volunteers that we support, that we work with. And this is one of the settings where we work with them. And then there's 20 of these tents, 20 of these stations throughout the course. On top of that, there's a hub there where they will take patients from here and drive them to a hub where they can triage them and then decide if they're going to go from there to a hospital or if they're going to go back to another tent that they have at forward command so that they can get rejoined with their loved ones or have further treatment. So there's 2 tents in the Grant Park. And then since we started doing this thing, we have several teams that we put in place, and I'll show you pictures of them in a minute. Both in Grant Park, where the race actually starts and finishes, and the last mile, which it had been defined as sort of the place where if there was going to be something bad that went on, it's most likely to happen there. So if you look at this picture again on the right, you'll see that, obviously they have the road closure signs, so there's no traffic going through there. There's an ice machine to help handle a lot of the things that happen with runners needing to have ice for their wounds and injuries. Behind that is an ambulance. There's typically an ambulance at every one of these stations. And I think there's a runner drop-off bus, which is in the back there. So if there's a person who doesn't have serious injuries, but they need to get back, they'll provide transport with another series of people that just take people back. The first year we did it, they asked us to take care of their runner transport system. And we did, and we had no idea what we were getting into, but we had 1,000 people that we had to kind of manage, and it was overwhelming. It kind of did us in. So we asked them to take that off our plate and let us just focus on the medical side. And that's worked out pretty well over the years. This is a typical medical tent team. These are all folks that are assigned to each one of these tents. You'll find that there's doctors, psychologists, massage therapists, nurses, EMTs, a whole bunch of folks that support that tent. And I said, this is a close up or a better picture of that same scene. The hams typically set their station up behind or not. They're not inside the medical tent, but they're either aligned with them close by or they're down the street from them. Every station offers different kind of opportunities for them to set up. So we have hams that are deployed inside that tent that basically are the teams that communicate back to forward command. And then every station has roving hams that can help support the medical team just outside the tent, or they can communicate directly with the medical team inside the tent as we need to get information from them. This is a typical ham team. Well, it's a little team that just another one. I have a couple of pictures of some of our teams here. There's another group of guys set up, ready to roll. Another group, sort of lousy pictures from their phone, but that's the way it goes. As I mentioned, we have these roving teams. These are folks that will work with a medical team, 2 or 3 people on foot in Grant Park, and they basically run their butts off for about 3 hours. They literally are running from one emergency to another to see. The call usually is runner down, and these guys will go try to find out where that runner is. Of course, they work in zones, so it's not like they've got to run them 100 miles, but it's within 100 feet or so. They've got to dash off to where that patient is, provide them with care, and if it needs to be escalated, the ham radio folks are there to call in the ambulance company that can come in with bigger equipment to help take care of things. It's a complicated position. It's hard to find people to do this job, but it's the one of the most rewarding, I think, for the folks that do it. And it's become one of the more critical jobs for us as the years have gone on. An extension of that team is what we call pre-finish, which is the last mile. As I mentioned, originally that was thought to be where the most harm would happen, most incidents might happen. It's true, there are some very serious things that happen in the last mile, but that's not necessarily where like, say, cardiac events happen. Turns out cardiac events happen almost anywhere, but that is where a lot of runners are really at the end of their rope, and lots of interesting things happen there. In this case, we deploy our team not with the medical team, but within a few feet of each other, so we can stretch that line out so that there's medical teams in between the hams, so that if there were an issue, the ham can race back to where the medical person is and provide support for them. So we actually have a long line of people, and that line, by the way, can grow up to about 100 people. And so it just depends on the year and how many volunteers they get. They would like to have 100 people that fill that last mile, but we this last year, for instance, only had about 45 medical people. It's getting harder and harder to find medical people who want to devote their time to this kind of process. COVID has really hit this industry pretty hard, I'd say. One of the challenges we have now coming in after COVID, and I didn't talk about COVID much, but we had to stop for a year because of COVID, and then we did it. We did it 1 year, and it was a pretty herky-jerky process. But coming back from COVID, we found that we actually lost a lot of our really senior level folks. And so we had to do a lot of recruiting. The recruiting we got delivered us a lot of young folks, or young people, I mean, young to the hobby, who had no experience with public service. And it happened at a time when really there was not a lot of support going on with other agencies that were providing training for this kind of stuff. So we found that we had to do a lot of the training ourselves. If you're new to this sport, or if you're new to this game, any of it, public service as a community event like we just did, or if you're doing a disaster, there's a huge amount of stuff to learn. Not the least of which is to buy a radio. And so which radio to buy, and then how do you use it? There's a huge amount of learning that goes into it. And so even though a lot of these guys can probably get a license in a day, that doesn't mean they're ready to do an event like this. So it's pretty challenging to get them up and running. but it's an absolutely necessary part of what we have to face and do. Of course, there's lots of supplemental gear to buy as well. So there's investment in equipment, headsets, remote mics, better antennas, and all that sort of thing. And, of course, sometimes there's clothes. I mean, vests that you need to buy, certain kinds of boots that you might want to wear, that sort of thing. So there's kind of an investment involved that when you first come into it, say, yeah, I'll volunteer. And then you start going through the list of sort of the things we'd like to see you kind of think about investing in. It scares a lot of other folks out. And then, of course, the other thing is just to get them trained so they know what their job is. So when they do show up, they actually can do it. And we've had people who have shown up who you thought would be perfect for the job. And then they come up and their radio isn't programmed. They don't know why they're there. They haven't read any of our literature that we provide them or even gone to any of the training. And it's a frustrating experience for everybody. What we tend to do, though, is take experienced guys and mix them in with some of our new guys. So you're never really totally on your own. We always try to mix people up. And our teams go in various sizes. We have, in the early part of the course, we tend to have teams and stations with 4 people. So 2 people that man, our main radios out of the tent, and then 2 to help support the interior communications between doctors and our radio folks. And then that team can get bigger. So as you go into the later stations, like 20 or 19, there can be as many as 8 or 9, 10 people at that station. And by the way, we start at like 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, and they go until 4 in the afternoon. So it's a very long day, especially for the folks in that last part. And the problem is that the way the course is set up, if you are deployed anywhere, once you're there, you're there. Once the race starts, you can't just go home. You've got to wait till the race ends, and it's a big challenge to get around. So you can't move around much. So you get assigned to a station that pretty much becomes your home for the day. Our communication strategy. These are some pictures of our forward command tent, where we have typically 8 to 12 people who work in our forward command posts there. Pulling in all the information that we need to get. We have 2 chains of communication. One is medical, where we have 2 people basically devoted to just collecting medical communication, urgent issues. We need an ambulance moved. We have a patient that's being transported. We have an urgent care problem. Whatever that is, that gets communicated to a medical network. And then we work very closely with Superior Ambulance, which is the contract ambulance service for this event. And they will dispatch an ambulance if there's not one there already. And so we work closely with them. In fact, we have a dispatcher right in our forward command area, so we can pretty readily get ambulance service to those folks. As I said earlier, we don't do this alone. We're just one part of a huge, huge operation. I'll show you a little teeny picture of that later. And then we started doing logistic communication, and that started out with just providing medical supplies. So typically when you go an event like this, you start out thinking it's going to be 68 or 70 degrees. And so you have a kind of a set of what gear you're going to put out. Well, then all of a sudden the weather changes the day before, and all of a sudden your conditions change, and you've got to really start rearranging your early plans. And so there can be a scramble to provide medical supplies. Now, either way you do it, there's always a scramble to get enough medical supplies because you don't entirely know, even though they've got metrics that go back many years, you don't entirely know what you're going to face or where it's going to be the most dramatic. So where you're going to have the most injuries, where you're going to have the most problems. So we started providing a couple of years ago a thing called pace and stress metrics. We were looking for a way to give them some way of getting an idea of how well the medical teams are managing their patient load or their medical supply issues. So we put a call out every 30 minutes looking for them to tell us, how many patients did you serve in the last 30 minutes? And what stress are you under? And on a scale from 1 to 5, is it going easily? You have no problem at all, or is it a nightmare and you've got big problems? And that would cue up a little light on our display board in the forward command tent. And so we could drill down and say, look, aid station 5 has a red light. What the heck's going on down there? And we get down there and find out that, they're out of medical supplies. They've got too many patients. So there's some kind of a hang up, and they've got people sitting on the street. And so, that's a quick way for us to find out what's going on and be able to communicate that to the race authorities. Plus, the other part of our logistics communication is just unusual activities. After the Boston bombing, there were several look-alike bombers that were running around Chicago with backpacks who looked just like those guys. And we had to report those in. And of course, that would dispatch the police off to go find those guys. A couple of years ago, well, really from the early beginnings, we had a guy on our team who was a weather professional. He used to work as a contract weather guy for the United Airlines, but he was also a ham radio guy. And he and his club used to provide, Skywarn forecasts. And he got involved with us and actually brought a whole new level of thinking to this event. I mean, they had never really seriously looked at how to manage the weather conditions. But when Dave got involved with this group and we started providing them with data on a course about where the temperature is or what conditions are going on. I mean, we're talking about a fairly big metropolitan area. Conditions in the north can be way different than something on the south side. And so this opened up a whole new avenue for us and has become a pretty good part of what we provide. Although last year, they were so excited about what that we were finding from this data that they actually connected with a university, a bunch of students who now are pretty much deployed throughout the whole course. And so now they got 1 billion data points and they're getting way more information than we can provide. And of course, now they're providing that information, not verbally as we had been doing. And now they're trying to do it more using web programs so they can populate spreadsheets more readily. But the point is that it became an amazing part of the operations for this event, to the point where they started to begin to see patterns of where their runners would really collapse. And they collapsed a lot, not where you think it would be like the midway point of the course. It was where the course turned into a part of the city where there were no trees. And so suddenly the heat was the thing that was taking the runners out. And as they studied that data and you started to see where the most runners who dropped out or had really serious injuries were, the event has started to change the way the course is laid out. So as we move forward in this in the future, they're going to start thinking about making the course longer and in places where there's more tree cover. So this is a place where climate change is an impact on the race, but it's also a place where the data we collected has given them a chance to see how that the impact that it has. The other thing is just the changes in course conditions, like unusual crowds. People follow these runners. There's usually about 2 million people that follow the runners throughout the course. There can be bottlenecks. There can be huge issues where the crowd is trying to press in to the runners, and we report that back to police to help to coordinate that. More likely than not, we get a lot of weird problems where people want to drive their car onto the course. And of course, where there have been issues with that, with our own, in the world, we've had people who try to disrupt the world. That's become a fairly serious concern. So if somebody starts driving up the course, that can be a very traumatic experience for him if he doesn't stop. There was a time when we had a guy who was pissed off because he couldn't get his car out of his parking lot, and it meant going onto the race course. We knew that if he did that, they had orders to shoot to kill if he was on the course. And so we had to persuade this guy not to drive on the course. It gets pretty serious as we move into these kind of strange times. Obviously, we dealt with medical supplies. That's always the case. And then urgent issues. I mean, urgent issues can be anything: weather conditions, rerouting the traffic around a disaster or a problem. We do a lot of practice scenarios every year. We meet with the city to talk about what happens if. So one of the issues we talked about one year was what happens if there's a fire on one of the routes, and how do we reroute traffic. One year we had a person who was trying to commit suicide off one of the bridges in Chicago. And so we had to reroute traffic very quickly around that. People never knew that the thing had been rerouted and changed, but that's the kind of thing you ran up against. Very interesting problem this year. One of the scenarios we worked on was what happens if you lose communications, if somebody either sabotages or something happens to your phone network and to your radio network. And that was a scenario we had to work on and discuss what would we do if that happened. And, we all kind of scoff and say, well, that's not going to happen, right? Well, it turns out, and everybody defended their universe. So the fire department said, this is what we would do. The police said, here's what we would do. The city said, here's what we would do. And then the people that run the marathon said, well, here's what we would do. We have our own, our own commercial network, and we have the hams. I show up to work on Sunday, the day of the race, at 6. Well, I'm there at 3 a.m. But at 5, I get the race director comes up to me and he says, we have a problem. Our radio system is down. We cannot do any long range communications to any of our people. We can only do short range communications. They need us to help provide communications. I thought he was joking when he first said that, but it turned out to be a real thing. All right, that's fine. We had a network. We could do it. We had people that we could do it. We get into our spot and we find out that one of our repeaters is down, that somebody was doing malicious interference and had shut that repeater down. And so now we had one leg down. Now we have a lot of backups, so we could kind of make that work. But it meant a doubling up of duties for a lot of folks and a lot of scrambling in the morning. The fact is that we did it. I was very proud that we did it, and nobody knew that we had problems. I never shared that with them, but it was it was an interesting lesson that we had just discussed that week before the race. What would happen if? And here we are facing it in that race. We use and this is more information that I normally provide folks like this audience, but typically we have I think 6 embedded repeaters that belong to various radio clubs that we've partnered with. And most of these are people that we partnered with from the beginning after we tested this and found that their repeaters worked well and worked for this event. We pretty much have stuck with a plan that uses them to support us. We've run into some issues. And so we're starting to move to other things. One of the things we're moving to is deployed repeaters. So we're trying to use tactical repeaters that service certain little areas so that we don't have such a big footprint. So for instance, our main medical repeater is a repeater that works almost 50 miles outside of the city. It's a huge footprint. And to start passing traffic through that draws a lot of attention. And sometimes we've drawn a lot of negative attention, things that we don't really want to have people knowing about. On the other hand, it's good to have course-wide communication. So it's great for a QST to the whole course. It's bad for things like providing, incident information that you don't want to have necessarily everybody knowing about. So one of the things we're moving towards is to build a network of more deployed repeaters that will service certain areas, or maybe there's places we step down to if we need to. But in this case, every one of our nets, and we have 2 medical nets and 4 logistics nets, each one of them has backup repeaters. So there's always a backup to what we do. And so that's served us very well over the last couple of years. Just to give you an idea what Forward Command looks like, this is one part of our antenna farm. We use a lot of different antennas. We're in a canyon, on the right side of this picture is a whole bunch of buildings that we've got to kind of crawl over. So this is our antenna farm. One of the things I learned from field day is it's very difficult to work with a bunch of radios in the same room. And so this is no different than field day. And so the challenge we had to face right from the beginning was, how do you put 5 or 6 UHF radios in the same room and make everybody happy? And it took a long time for us to find the right formula. We've tried lots of different things. Separation certainly is one of them. Low power was another. But we're getting better and better at solving this problem without having to go to some big muscular solution. But we're using simple little ham radio technology and principles. We've been able to kind of conquer that problem pretty well. These are just some pictures of Forward Command. This is one of our guys working the logistics nets. Another one of our medical nets. This particular guy is helping manage the triage teams that I've talked about. So he's got maps there that shows where those people are positioned, and he can track them on that. We've this year introduced a new product. We're using APRS now with each one of those people. So we can go on a computer and see exactly where they are and locate them, because in Grant Park, while there's a lot of things that are marked there are a lot of people in that place, and it's very hard to find people. So we give all these guys flags so that if they need to find somebody, they can wave the flag. But the APRS is a new tool that we're trying to see if it will help us locate where they are. And then the person's hands on the bottom there is the phone, who's the dispatcher from the Superior Ambulance. And we need to communicate with them about how to find the radio team. So, and the medical team. So that's a product we started working with this year. We've been developing it for a couple of years, but we're pretty happy with where that's going. Just another picture of our forward command guy. This is my deputy lead. He pretty much handles the medical side of things. I handle most of the logistics stuff. So we break our responsibilities down and pass a lot of traffic. This is a pretty busy place for us. This is a picture I'm not supposed to show, but it's not the current setup, so I think it's okay. But this is the forward command tent where the race runs their operations. There's mostly, this is the operations of the race from the event management side. Behind the curtain is police and fire and a lot of other municipal offices. And so we're in another separate part of the tent to accommodate this room. So this room is basically the mind control for the whole event. And that's different than other events. Other events don't do it this way. As I said, this is the hub and spoke model. There are others that are completely decentralized. If you go to the Marine Corps Marathon, for instance, totally decentralized. The hams aren't even in the same place where the brain trust is that's running the event. It's pretty interesting how that goes. This is a picture of me and in my little position there. Want to point out that I'm not at a radio. I pretty much don't have time to listen to a radio. I talk to another guy in the tent who is working the medical logistics piece. So if there's a call for a product that they need to have in the field, I'll talk to him by radio and he can tell the lady next to him what they need and where they need it. So, but I don't typically listen to the traffic going on out there. I do if there's a trouble spot, but what we typically do is we'll write down trouble tickets and do it all by paper because it moves too fast. So for instance, if I've got to get a fire hydrant opened, I can take that piece of paper, dash over to where the fire department is, have them handle it way quicker and know where that place is way quicker than I could if I had to put it into a spreadsheet. So I do a little bit of running, but I like the exercise. So it helps, keeps me healthy. This last year, we started a new group, partly born out of the fact that this is our 15th year, partly born out of the fact that I'm not getting younger and I got to figure out a way to keep some continuity going here. And partly the fact that there's a need to keep this going and to find new hams and other hams that we can train and keep the process going. So we started a thing called Ham Radio Chicago. It's a not-for-profit group. We just started it. The idea is to be a service group. We want to be a service group to other clubs to help them support their activities. We don't want to compete with the clubs. We want to, our primary job is the Chicago Marathon, but we are also helping other groups do their events. And so this year we've done 3 other events where we provided them with either manpower or resources or, some thoughts about how to organize it. And, so that's one of the goals that we're hoping to do with this group. It's a 501c3, so we're hoping to raise money so that we can pay for more of those deployed repeaters, pay for some training, maybe get some equipment that we can share, that sort of thing. As I mentioned, we're working with a lot of other events behind the scenes. And then we're hoping to make this resource available to other groups doing similar things. I mean, what we've found is even though we've been in touch and we've modeled a lot of our own work based on what other races have done, we find that everybody's got their own unique circumstances, and you can't say, here's Chicago and how we did it, so this will work in Boston or it will work in Houston. It's all a little different, but you can take some of the principles and make them work for you. So it's basically an organization that was born out of our past experience, our past events, and we've been pretty successful at what we've done, I have to say. I mean, we've not only have brought ham radio to the party so that the Office of Event Management in Chicago really knows what ham radio is and does, but FEMA came down and actually monitored us, monitored the whole team. The whole event was monitored by FEMA. It was a pretty scary time because they had embedded their observers next to us. We had 3 observers in our forward command tent. They had guys all over the city. They had one guy that was sitting in a hotel monitoring our channels. And that was just us. They were doing the same thing for all the other city services. And we all came out of it with glowing reports. And so that was kind of some vindication that we were doing something right, I guess. Um, we are grateful to the 140 hams that have stepped up and have done this year after year. This year was our biggest year at 145 hams. And because of them, we're actually able to show what ham radio does to our community. And a lot of guys come up and they see that ham radio and they're trying to set the ham radio operator sign. And they say, well, they would make jokes about the fact that, where do we get the ham? Ham radio is invisible to our world. And if we don't have ways to bring it and make it more visible, this is going to be a resource that's not going to live much longer. So there's a challenge to you and us all to keep finding ways to make ham radio accessible and useful to the world. I think this event strategy is a good one. I'm not sure disasters are something that we're going to get much headway in, but I think serving events is certainly what our future looks like. If you want to get a hold of me, that's one way to do it, k9rst@awrl.net. This is a picture of our guys working the Shamrock Shuffle, which is one of the 3 races that this marathon runs. And it obviously can get cold. I mean, this was in March, and it can be a little cold. In the summer, it can get really hot. So we work at all extremes. Anyway, that's sort of the end of my formal part. If there are any questions, I'll be glad to entertain them. Oops. I'll stop sharing my screen and we can segue over. Oh, that's everybody.
All right, Marty, go ahead.
Okay, Rob, great presentation. Thank you very much. You mentioned using APRS. Are there any other aspects of this where you have gone from conveying information by voice to conveying it as data?
It's our best shot at trying that out. And we've tried a couple of different things using more data traffic, but we haven't really pursued it as much as we should. It's something that's evolving. We found that the voice traffic sort of works pretty well. We can get it there pretty quickly. But, for instance, that one year when I said they didn't know how many runners were dropping out, turns out there were 1,000 runners. That could have been handled a lot differently. And now they do it much differently. That was just a massive amount of information that we just couldn't handle. So there's a limit to what the voice can do. I admit that. And but getting the tools that do the right job is really takes time to develop that.
Yeah, but voice is still the common skill of everybody you've got working for you. The other question is, I know in the Los Angeles Marathon they have taken to setting up odd splits for the repeaters so that some casual ne'er-do-well is going to have a harder time interfering with the repeater because they don't know where the input is. Have you done anything like that or thought about it?
The repeater groups we've got already, to keep them on the same page, we haven't done that. And we've had very limited problems. We only have this one, the same repeater keeps attracting the same kind of disgruntled groups. And so as much as I love those guys, I may have to pull them off into a standby mode. But that's a good thing to kind of look at. The biggest problem is just a lot of these repeater groups are older guys who don't have the resources to get into the repeater anymore. They can't physically get to the repeater. So this repeater that I was just telling you about, that the guy who was doing malicious interference, no one was up to the site for like 6 months. And when they finally got up to the site to see why they were having so much trouble with us, they found out that their antenna had been knocked over when they replaced the air conditioner. And so there was no antenna up there. So, I mean, and this is a common problem with a lot of our guys, is that the repeaters, the teams that put those guys in place are now aging out. There's not a generation that knows how to service them. So one of the things we're hoping to offer with our group is some resources where if you need technical help to manage your repeater, we can help find that. This guy, for instance, used to have a big voting system in their 2-meter system, but they don't have the resources now to even get that going. So to do what you're suggesting is kind of a challenge, is I guess what I'm saying. Yeah.
Thanks.
And, we've been looking at digital means too. We were looking at what we did last year. We had this last year. Well, for a couple of years, we've been using DMR as a way to isolate from some of the run-of-the-mill sort of hams that don't have that kind of technology. we did play. I know the marathon, the Chicago Marathon, or the Marine Corps Marathon used D-Star quite a bit for metered traffic, for data traffic. We explored that and found that we were better off doing with what we did with voice. So anyway, and the big thing is with all these things, you got to work with the group you've got. So 140 guys, you get 140 guys to have specialized radios that can do all that stuff, is a challenge. And so basically you work with the lowest common denominator, which is like analog audio, analog FM radio, and work from there.
God, thank you.
Thanks for the question. That's good.
Okay, Bill. Take it away, Bill.
There we go. Question, you mentioned putting APRS on your people with, what were they carrying, trackers or D7400s, or how did you manage that?
Several people have their own radio. So we bought a bunch of Anytone radios that have an APRS feature in it. And it's fairly lightweight because we got a lot of pushback from the triage teams, because clearly for them to haul around and run for 4 hours with more weight than they already are carrying was a struggle. Now we've discovered a lot of other new APRS units that are, little microwatt unit things, but this was I think it was a watt or 5 watts anyway. It was pretty solid signals from those things, and it wasn't a big intrusive. It wasn't a huge burden to ask them to carry those around, and so each one of them had a HT basically that just did that job. That's all it did. We didn't ask them to provide any other radios that did both. It was just that radio was dedicated to that service. And it worked pretty well for us trying to figure out where people were, because we're dealing with a fairly small area. I couldn't even venture to guess how many square feet we're talking about, but it's, we're talking about an area that's, not even a half a mile, probably maybe 500 square feet, where everything happens. You got a lot of things going on in a short, very small, very narrow area, a lot of people packed in there. So it allowed us to drill down to about 3 feet so we could figure out where people were.
Okay.
And then the trick we have is coordinating with the other services. The fire department says, well, we can do that. And the Superior Ambulance says, well, we can do that. Well, the problem is they all can do it, but they don't, or they don't know how to. And then we don't know how to still communicate with them on their systems. So it's still tricky. I mean, the ideal solution is to have the same thing going on with the medical guys who are looking, like the Superior guys who are responding, and our guys, so we can put the two together. It's hard to get everybody on the same page.
Do you remember the radio model for that, or?
Yeah, it's the Anytone. I think 878. It's the newest one that's out for Anytone, and 878. I can't remember the number right off. I've got it sitting up on the other desk, and I don't have it here. So
okay, thanks.
I'm just brain dead. Sorry.
Dave's got one on his screen there.
Yeah, that's not the most recent one, I don't think, though, is it?
Yeah, it's a 878 UV3 plus.
Yeah, right. Okay. I just couldn't tell because it kind of is whopping around there.
Yeah.
That worked out pretty well, and it was easy to use. We torture tested it for we did a couple of sessions where we tried to torture test it, and we were pretty satisfied with how well it worked. We did that at off frequency. We weren't using the most common frequency used for APRS, and so that worked out. And then another team tried it with a digipeater, and in an area where we don't really need to have that kind of traffic, because there are enough. In the last mile, they were trying to use it. In the last mile, there are light poles, and everything is marked with a number. Everyone is 5 to 10 feet apart, so it's not like that hard to find people. So, but in Grant Park, it's like this Brownian movement of all kinds of people milling around, and it's really hard to find people. Everybody looks the same color. It doesn't matter what you're wearing; they're all wearing colored stuff, and so you can't find each other. Even if you're wearing a bright vest, it's hard to find everybody. I said, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just commenting, looking in chat, and that question has already been answered. So I don't see more hands in the crowd. Let's get some hands up, folks.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Jim McMahon out of Idaho. I was just sitting in on a presentation with the FBI and InfoGuard with regard to more individuals targeting things to take and cause problems, particularly in large races or things with great notability. You talked about backup systems, et cetera. How serious have you gotten about figuring these type of things out? So if you had somebody who decided, hey, I want to blanket kill off communications, what's your backup going to be?
It's funny because it's become much more of a germane issue, especially this year when the marathon itself lost its communication strategies. I think it showed them that it can happen, and that I think it's on the radar screen now. So we're going to have to all talk about it. I think that's one of the things. We have a monster backup plan that scares the hell out of me if I ever had to do it, because I don't think anybody would ever figure it out. But it's very simple, but it's still very complex. And it breaks the whole thing down into smaller, tiny little units that everybody has to respond to that. We've never had to practice it because we never could. But it's defined. Okay, I can say I have a backup plan. It's right here. But it relies a lot more on simplex and smaller units talking to each other. However, if the big repeaters are gone, we're fried. They're certainly with ham radio and with our mobile radios, we could develop a pretty good relay system where we could use UHF, which, by the way, when you look at the band plan that FEMA defines as the way to get out of the big one, it's all UHF communications. If we ever had the big one where everything died, the reliant communications is going to be just UHF radios talking to each other. Assuming we don't have some kind of impulse.
I came out of law enforcement, and even back in the dark ages in the 70s, we had local agencies had a tough time talking to each other, but California developed CLAMARS, California Law Enforcement Mutual Assistance Radio, so that literally you could have somebody from San Francisco go down to Los Angeles and still be able to talk to the next car over. And that was their backup system until somebody figured out, well, CLAMARS can get jammed as well. So they had a red and a blue channel. So, again, it's one of those things where you think about what's my worst case scenario, build to it, and then never disclose it, because God help you if you have to throw the big switch. You want to make sure it works right the first time.
Illinois, we have a thing called Starcom, which was built a massively complex, dense network with multiple layers of backups. And even it's vulnerable, I guess, I've heard from various people. And these are the best and most, expensive minds working on the problem. So, we're just little guys here. So,
Well, especially in the world of disaster communications, there's both commercial and non-commercial people that all say they got the best system. It will never fail. And I've never seen that not happen someplace. Victor, go ahead.
Good evening. I have two questions. The first one, based on a friend posted a list, I believe it was from ANSI, on different color coding for work helmets, which put red in one department, orange in another department, blue in a different department, green in another one, so that they were all, you could look at them and know who was what. As I look at your one of the photos there, I noticed one of the officials was wearing a red neckband, which I know red is Chicago. But is everything in Chicago red, or do they have them categorized in different color groups so you can identify people? And the second question is, how do you stop a marathon now since you had that incident? Does everybody have a flag that you wave and runners start to get the idea that we have to quit because there's an order out here? Or how do you stop 20,000 runners, 50,000 runners? Thank you.
Of course, the thing itself has come up with a color code scheme that defines what different levels of people are supposed to wear. The hams have always been kind of rogues about it because we have those safety vests that we wear. They've given us some god-awful orange vests that say radio communications, and most of the hams hate them, so they don't wear them. But they do have a color code system that they spent a lot of money putting together, and they're now in the process of changing it, because they're beginning to find that some things like MD doesn't mean anything to an international person who's looking for a doctor. So now they're thinking they're going to say something like doctor on their shirt. But the bigger problem is that when you're in a massive crowd and you're looking for the doctor, you can't see them because everything's wearing different colors. So it's very hard to find people, even if they are with discrete colors. That's sort of, I've forgotten the other question. What was the second part of your question there?
How do you stop 50,000 runners?
Okay, yeah. So there have been several different strategies that we've discussed. One is that we break the race down into smaller segments so that we can literally stop a group of runners from one segment to the next. So anybody that's in that little segment would be stopped with corrals and that sort of thing. They also put not only us on course so we can do communications and tell people that that's what's going to happen. We have flags now that we put out that are emergency alert system flags that tell people what the conditions of the race are. So if it's green, for instance, it means it's a good running conditions. If it's black, it means the race is over. You need to stop. So that's a visual way for them to see it. The other thing they did is they put DJs, who are the bane of most ham radio guys, but they have DJs at each one of the 8 stations, mostly playing pump up music. But when it gets to the point where you need to make an announcement of some magnitude, these guys can scream at folks, the race is over, stop. But the bigger issue is that there are blocks. We can stop them by segment. We've actually rehearsed this in various kind of task groups where we tried that out. And so that's one way to do it. The other thing is they have several diversion routes that are identified ahead of time. So if they need us just cut the route off and push people into a big park, they've got those things predefined, and then we could just show people off to various places and divert them. And that would slow them down, so they're not going to keep going. So there's several different strategies, and we've had to use one or two, but not the whole course.
Who
Yeah.
Who would be in charge of making those decisions?
So there's a brain trust that runs the event, and the race director is in the tent, and he's got the pulse of the whole place. And in that one shot I showed you where those operations folks are all at screens, he's a young guy who likes doing everything by computer. So he's texting a mile a minute. So this massive pile of people who are on their screens texting him a mile a minute. But he does keep up with what's going on and the pulse of what's going on. He's got deputies that work with him that do manage different parts of the race. So there's one group that just deals with the route. There's one group that just deals with tents. There's another one that does just with medical. There are also cameras that are all over the place that feed into his network. So he's sitting there and he can see pretty much what's going on just about anywhere. That's a network that the police have put in place, but it's also a network that the marathon has put in place. And so, he's a pretty busy guy a race day, and relies on a lot of resources for him to get it done. So we're just one other little group that supports we mostly support the medical hub of this group. And, there's a NIM structure that they all follow. So everybody knows who the command structure is and who does what to whom. And, so that's been an important part of that piece too.
Okay, thank you very much. Marty, go ahead.
Yeah, just the question about stopping the race. We've had to do that a couple of times on the Baker to Vegas, where it's covering thousands of square miles of sometimes inhospitable terrain. And one of the things that we can do as using radio, which is one-to-many, that they can't use with Verizon Cellular, is to get everybody to stop. Now, the mechanism for that is having in our case, the stages are roughly 6 miles apart. Each stage has an officer in charge. Now, maybe because the runners are all law enforcement, they have better appreciation for an officer in charge than the general public might, who are running a marathon. But the officer in charge can, if we get the word, they can hold all the runners and keep them from going to the next stage. In our case, the typical stop race is because it just happened a couple of years ago. It was very hot. This is running, the start of the race runs through the close to Death Valley. And they started having runners fall right and left, just go down. And they ended up running out of rescues to take them to the hospitals. And since if somebody else got hurt, there was no rescue to get to them. So they had to stop the race till they delivered their patients and got back on the course. And then they had to figure out, how do we restart the thing? And they hadn't thought that through very well. We had some suggestions, but the race guys hadn't figured that out. But by having somebody in an official capacity at certain intervals, and of course the marathon, it wouldn't necessarily be every mile, but maybe every 5 miles, one person with the authority over the race course there, that seemed to work in our case.
Rob, you're muted.
Every time I cross my arms, I sort of shut the mic off, I guess. Am I back on?
You're on.
Okay, so our aid stations are about 1.5 miles apart. There are zones. All of our stations are in different zone groupings. So there's a zone lead who can command, what happens in that zone. But that's 1.5 miles isn't too much to kind of control the crowd that happens there. Although one of the things they're wanting to do is, the marathon this year had 49,000 runners. They want to get up to 65,000 runners, and so that's their goal. They hope to do it by 2026. That's going to put a lot of pressure on the medical teams, which right now they're struggling to even get enough volunteers for. We've been trying to amp up the marathon. The ham radio operators, so we can get more of those as well. And I've been happy to see that we've been pretty successful at trying to recruit more, but we could certainly use more. And but I think it's getting to the point where we're getting some better notoriety, and people want to be a part of it. They're starting to see that this can be fun.
The problem with adding another 20,000 runners is that it's not the cream of the crop you're adding. It's the ones who maybe shouldn't be running. So you're likely to have a disproportional increase in aid calls.
So like what they did last year, because they felt bad about the race being over at 4, and there's still, 10% of the runners still out there. So the race is over at 4 o'clock. It's defined as being over. And so all these guys crossing the finish line that was gone because they'd already taken it down. And so they're getting a lot of, bad publicity from that. So this last year, they decided to keep the race, the finish line, the structure, up until 6 o'clock. That meant that we had to have a medical team there ready to handle whatever came across the line. It extended the day and beyond, the normal hours. So yeah, you're absolutely right. That's the challenge. So a longer day for all of us.
Sounds like there's a lot of decisions and to be made and discussions between now and the next one.
Okay, you already had a meeting yesterday, starting to talk about the next marathon. So there are plenty of marathons. If you want to, if you're bored and looking for something to do, get involved with a marathon, you'll spend the rest of your life going to meetings.
I'm not bored, trust me.
No, neither am I. But
none of us are.
Okay, anybody else got their hand up? Is there anything in chat? Nope, there's nothing in chat going on. Well, we've gone over our hour. It's been a great presentation. Really appreciate you coming on and doing this. Learned a lot. I think we all did. Of course, when you get this thing out on the YouTubes and all the other places, it gets hit a zillion times more. So you did another service to amateur radio. Okay, folks, unless there's something else, I'm going to start pulling the plug here and look forward to see you guys next week.